All right, before we begin, just want to make sure everyone can hear me all right. If you can't, do 10 jumping jacks. All right, you good? All right, wonderful. Okay, we're going to get started with our talk. Welcome to Synergy 209. Let's get serious about hybrid cloud deployments. I am Angelo Saracino, product manager on virtual apps and desktops, and I'm joined here with...
I'm Leo Singleton. I'm an architect at Citrix, responsible also for virtual apps and desktops.
And if you want to join the conversation, we have the following hashtags. You can tweet at us at Citrix Synergy and Citrix Workspace, and also tweet using the session tag. So let's get into what this talk is about. We're going to get into what hybrid deployments are. We're going to go through the reasons of what and why you would use a hybrid deployment. Then we'll talk about configuring your Citrix deployment for a hybrid configuration. And then we're going to get really deep into the use case specifics of what the benefits of hybrid entail. We're going to get into phase migration, your disaster recovery, and then also handling bursts. So first, we're going to get into what and why is a hybrid deployment, and what at Citrix we consider a hybrid deployment is. To begin, well, it's not a Prius, but it's a style of configuration where you have both a public cloud and on-premises data center workloads. Basically, you allow both the data and applications to be shared across your different workloads and environments. You can use this to take advantage of scale, agility, and cost flexibility. And we really want to double down on cost here, really, because there's a lot of use cases where if your on-premises data center unfortunately goes down, you're costing your company millions of dollars. So proper preparation and prevention would really help you handle those costs. And then specifically, we're going to get into the use cases and benefits of hybrid deployments. So one of which is disaster recovery, where if there's anything wrong with both the cloud or on-premises data center, you can provide a very consistent experience for your end users. It will actually help you with your phase migration. I'm pretty sure everyone here has a director or so that has a certain timetable to move to the cloud. Doing a hybrid deployment will allow you to move to the cloud at your own pace. And then geo expansion, where you can be able to either expand into certain geos without you having to set up a new location. This is really very resonant with folks that are expanding in India or China who do not want to have a physical footprint, but just want to take advantage of existing infrastructure or public cloud. And then in addition, burst scenarios. Everyone here has probably been in a situation where they've had unexpected workloads and might have had overrun. And especially if you're on or scaling an on-premises data center, whenever you add more hardware, that's a fixed cost that's going to be with you for the rest. Whereas the cloud, you get to be much more flexible. Now, to help talk through what your configuration for hybrid will look like, Leo will take it away.
Thanks. So in all of the use cases for hybrid, there's 4 factors that you really have to consider, and in this particular order too. The first thing is always going to be the site-to-site connectivity. We'll talk about your options on the next slide. Second is identity. You need to connect your identity up to the cloud. Third is external access. We'll walk you through the different options for providing external access to your users. And then last but not least is the Citrix configuration. This is when you go into Studio or the Managed console, the Managed tab of our console, and go in and actually configure your environment. So let's start with site-to-site connectivity. As I said, regardless of what the use case is, this is really going to be your first consideration when you set up a hybrid deployment. And we really offer 3 options here. I look at them as good, better, and best. Right? The easiest option is going to be just to use a plain old VPN. Every cloud vendor out there offers these. They're easy to set up, and they're fine for low bandwidth situations where reliability isn't the most important. And that's like your POC environments, dev test type environments. You can always just start here. A big improvement over a typical VPN is going to be an SD-WAN. We have a great Citrix SD-WAN product. It's not that much harder to set up than a VPN, but it gives you that reliable multipath routing. It's going to give you QoS on your traffic. It's going to be a much better option for extending your on-premises data center up to the public cloud than just a regular VPN. And then last but not least are the private connections. The cloud vendors also offer these MPLS links where you can get private fiber dedicated up to the cloud. This is going to be the lowest latency option. Now, we'll talk about the different applications and whether your use case really requires this. It's going to be more expensive. It's also going to be very time consuming. This takes months to provision and set up. So you really only want to go here if you have a workload that depends on it.
So we get asked a lot about using different identity providers, especially for your hybrid deployments. Now, first we want to preface that we do get asked a lot about using Azure AD Domain Services or using ADFS. And they're generally not suitable for hybrid deployments, even though these are good options, especially if you want to maintain your access in the cloud or you're getting ready to go cloud only. However, for suitable for hybrid, you really want to go with your AWS directory services or extending your AD to the cloud through another site through a trust, or by setting up another site and then having the two sites on the same VNet. But end of the day, those three would probably be suitable as you move forward. And I want to take a moment to describe a trust a little bit further. So when you have both your site for your on-premises and your cloud, you need to make sure that the same users are both persistent on your cloud and to your on-prem. So there is a lot of situations where, again, with the ADFS, there's a shadow that is created, so which is fine for your SaaS apps, but if you have, for example, applications that might have a backend only on premises, you really need that consistency that a trust or extending your site can allow you to do so. Now, again, for example, connectors don't traverse the forest of the domain level, but we do offer a workaround where you can just deploy a pair of cloud connectors in each of your forests. Leo will be helping us talk through the external access.
So there are a couple of different options here. The first, the easiest, is we do talk to a few customers who don't require external access. The step isn't always required. Sometimes you've got a call center. Your employees only work from the office. They work on these thin clients. External access isn't a concern. It was just that network connectivity of the VPN, SD-WAN, express route to get out to the cloud. Now, we do offer another option, which is the Citrix Gateway service. Now, this is included with virtual apps and desktops. So everyone who buys apps and desktops from Citrix gets the gateway service. And we include a gigabyte per user per month of data. It's actually metered by the amount of data sent through the gateway. And it's pooled between your users. So it's not that you'll get an overage if a single user uses more than a gig. It's pooled between all of your users that you buy. And if one user uses 2 gigs and another user doesn't use the gateway service, then that averages out. Now, with the cloud service, we do have some customers that don't want to fully move to a Citrix Gateway service option. For these, you can continue to run your own Citrix Gateway. For the public cloud, we offer the Gateway VPXs. You can stand these up in AWS or Azure. Or for on-premises, you can still use the hardware MPX appliance, put that in a rack in your data center, and use that as your ingress. Now, one important consideration here, and we'll talk about the resource locations in a minute. If you're using multiple resource locations, you can pick and choose. So maybe you choose that I'm going to use the MPX for my on-premises data center. I'm going to take that 1 gig of data that I've got for the gateway service and pool that just for my cloud resource locations. Or maybe another use case is you have a couple of smaller branch offices and you want to use gateway service there, but manage your own gateways for the larger offices. All of those are options when it comes to external access with the virtual apps and desktop service. So now let's look at the Citrix architecture as we've just talked about. These are what we call resource locations. The resource location is going to be your data centers or a region in the public cloud that you pick. You probably already have Active Directory, some form of data, whether it's file shares, databases, or whatnot on premises. And the first factor is always setting up that connectivity. So it could be a direct connection, MPLS link, could be an SD-WAN, VPN. And then step 2 is to connect your data and identity. So we talked about the different options here with trust, with extending your AD sites. You need to get this set up. Now, here's where I would recommend do those first 2 steps before you ever even request a trial of the virtual apps and desktop service. It's a time trial, so the days start ticking. And you're not going to really be able to do much with the service until you've got to this point and you've got your resource locations, you've got your cloud connected to your on-premises network and identity set up. Once you provision the service, it's quick and easy. It's a SaaS offering. So you install your 2 cloud connectors. Now, the cloud connectors are a real key component to this cloud service. This is what enables Citrix to talk to the components in your resource locations. Now, for high availability, we're going to recommend a minimum of 2 cloud connectors per resource location. They're really easy to install, they're cheap to operate, they run on pretty low-end VMs, 2 cores, 4 gigs of RAM. They are a Windows installer, so they need to be domain joined to your network. That allows us to connect to your AD. That's how when you browse around within this virtual apps and desktop service, you can select your AD groups, users, provision machines in your OU. All of this happens via the cloud connectors. The other thing about the cloud connectors is they are auto-updating. So you just need to install them once and let the auto-updaters run. We push out updates roughly every 2 to 3 weeks. There's not a fixed schedule, but that's the usual cadence. And then all communication of these cloud connectors is going to be outbound from the cloud connector out to our cloud service over port 443. So everything's encrypted with TLS 1.2. A big change we made last quarter is we did deprecate TLS 1.0 and 1.1. The only communication now is over TLS 1.2. And it's not shown here, but we do support HTTP proxies. So some customers will choose to configure an HTTP proxy between the cloud connectors and the public internet. We do support that configuration. So once you have your cloud connectors, now comes your master image, right? This is the image that you use to create your VDAs from, using a technology like machine creation services. On the on-premises side, we do support PVS also. But one key consideration is that these two master images are not necessarily the same. And the reason for that is every hypervisor and public cloud out there has an agent, some tools that you need to install within the VM for optimal performance and management. And these differ from one vendor to another. We'll talk about this later in the session. You've got a couple of different options here on how you can automate this and create images that work both on-premises and cloud. Now you'll use MCS, you create your VDAs. These VDAs talk through the cloud connectors to get out to the internet. These are your actual workloads that your users log into. And you can have the same VDA image on-premises and in the cloud. Managed via Citrix, you can configure policies. We'll talk about this in the next section on how you configure the policies to route the users to both. And as we said, for external connectivity, you've got a couple options. One option is the gateway service. That means your Citrix Workspace app, your users will talk to our cloud service, our cloud managed gateway, and then down to the VDAs themselves. But you may also choose to manage your own gateway itself, whether it's an MPX on-premises or VPX out in the cloud.
So let's talk a little bit about how you would scale in the cloud. So first, I want to get into why you would want to do that, mostly because there are documented limits within how public clouds have their subscriptions or have their accounts. For a good example is that Azure, I believe, caps you out at 4,096 IPs applied to a subscription. So for example, before you want to hit that cap, you might want to, again, architect your cloud footprint in a different way. So I want to introduce the hub and spoke model. So what you would have is that in your public cloud hub, you'd have basically your data, your Active Directory, maybe your internet filters or other type of infrastructure. And then really, you would set up VNets to those spokes so you can transfer the traffic that you would get. So let's assume that we're going to have 2 spokes in our model. And what we want to do is we want to remove the cloud connectors, the master image, and our VDAs from our hub, and start setting up our master image in each of our spokes. Once we have our image set up, then we also want to set up our VDAs, and then have our cloud connectors in each spoke. And then in the public cloud hub, you would basically, as mentioned before, have your filters and whatnot.
One other consideration here, I also hear a lot, the hub and spoke model is very useful for performance. You can go to Azure's website, you can see the limits like 4,000 IP addresses, you can go to AWS or Google, see these same sort of hard limits. But more often than not, what I hear from customers is they start noticing the performance degrade as they get larger and larger and larger, and their catalogs start getting over 1,000 VDAs. They say, well, it's taking me 2 hours to update my image. One way to get around that is a hub and spoke model, where you start splitting into multiple spokes, all attached to a central hub where you've got your data, your internet filters, and those sort of devices. Keep those centralized, but for the VDAs and catalogs, spread them out into a hub and spoke model, and you'll see the performance go back to the same as a much smaller environment. Great way to scale. Now, one thing we haven't touched on, we've been talking about hybrid at a high level and how you deploy it. But let's say I want to deploy a hybrid deployment, Cloudburst situation with 4 apps, very simple. These are my 4 apps in Workspace. If I go into Virtual Apps and Desktop Service, what do I see is machine catalogs, delivery groups, applications, policies. It doesn't really map to some of what we've been talking about. So I want to walk you through the object model itself and how you would actually do that Citrix configuration within the console just to meet the architecture that we described. The first object you will find in the Virtual Apps and Desktops console is called a zone. Now, a zone defines your network topology. So basically, it's a LAN. It's going to be something that's high bandwidth, low latency. Everything within that zone can easily talk to each other. In general, this is going to be every on-premises data center you have, or if you're using public cloud, each region of the cloud will be a zone. Now, zones are basically the same as what you'll see resource locations in the Citrix Cloud Platform itself. And in fact, what happens is when you configure a resource location in the platform and install connectors, it automatically syncs into the Manage console as a zone with the connectors there. It really just, the difference in terminology comes from the on-premises product. Our existing XenApp admins for many years are used to the zones terminology, and that's what the console still says. So in my example, I've got 4 applications. Let's say our headquarters, our existing data centers in San Francisco, and I want to burst out into Azure. Closest region to us is going to be US West. So we would go into the Cloud Console, we'd configure 2 resource locations, we'd put our 2 connectors in each, we'd go in and we'd see 2 zones, San Francisco and Cloud US West. Second object within Virtual Apps and Desktops is called a host connection. So a host connection is what points our cloud service to your resource location. Now, in general, you're going to have 1 host connection per zone, but it's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping. And the reason for this is what Angelo was just describing with Hub and Spoke. Sometimes you're going to encounter scale limits, whether it's a public cloud or also on-premises hypervisors, they have the same sort of challenges. So let's say I'm using Citrix Hypervisor and I've hit the limit of the number of nodes I can put in a pool. So in San Francisco, I actually need 2 clusters of Citrix Hypervisor. I put 2 host connections in my San Francisco zone, and I put 1 host connection in US West to Azure. Third object is going to be a catalog. Now, the catalog represents the image itself and the VMs created from it. So you're going to need 1 of these per image, per host connection. In our case, let's make it the most complex we can. We're going to have 2 images. We're going to have 1 for the Office apps and a separate one for the browser apps, and we're going to put them on all 3 host connections. So we're going to have 2 catalogs of Office on the on-premises resource location, also 1 in cloud, and we'll do the same for the web browsers. So we've got a total of 6 catalogs here. Now, we don't really want to manage 6 different catalogs, and that's where delivery groups come in. So the next object you'll configure is called a delivery group in the console, and that's going to aggregate these catalogs back together into the objects you want to manage. Now, typically, this is where you would do your user assignment. So we are going to create 1 delivery group for our Office apps, 1 for our browser apps. This is where we can manage the users who have access to each. And then comes in zone preference. So when I create these delivery groups, I'm also going to want to create a zone preference policy to create the affinity of my users to the San Francisco data center or Cloud US West. Now, this is where these use cases we described come in. If you're doing an HA deployment, it's active-active. You may not need zone preference. You just load balance equally. If you're doing DR, then you'll probably prefer on-premises over cloud. Same for Cloudburst. You'd prefer your on-premises network with zone preference and then fail over to cloud when that one fills up. And last but not least, the application object. These are the resources that appear in Citrix Workspace app. There's going to be 4 of them, the 2 Office apps, the 2 web browsers, and these can span multiple delivery groups. I didn't show it here. There are use cases where you may want to have 1 app published from 2 delivery groups, but in this case, we don't need that. And so there it is. So with this deployment and this configuration within the Virtual Apps and Desktop service, we've taken these 4 applications, we've overcome scale limits of hypervisors, we've deployed them in the cloud, on premises, and all the users see are the 4 icons in Workspace app. They don't have to worry about what's going on behind the scenes. We can burst into the cloud when our on-prem capacity fills up, and the user never notices the difference.
Now it brings us to the second part of the presentation, where we get to go into the use case specifics. I want to preface this by saying that when it comes down to timetables for your phase migration, you might have applications that are very portable and simple. We're going to get into the different types of applications and workloads that you might have. And then for disaster recovery, we're going to get into the preparation of what you have to do first, and then what are the considerations that you have to account for when setting up a DR environment. And then we're also going to get into the types of bursts and workloads so you can scale efficiently throughout whatever sites you wish to use. So first, I'm going to get into phase migration. So these are the types of applications when it comes to the reason why you might want to do a migration, and then doing it in the way that you want to do so. Where the first step is really when you're doing a hybrid deployment, it's really all about pacing. You might have different timetables as to, for example, what workloads that need to be transferred over. You might have an application that's running on an NT server somewhere in the corner and you do not want to touch it. Then when you're doing your migration, you also get to pick which workloads are easier to migrate over others. And then as you guys are expanding into the cloud, you can basically, the new workloads that you have that are more self-contained, we're going to get into that later, can be spun up easier. And then while you're doing this hybrid mode can actually be done as long as you need to, for example, because there is a single pane of management when you have your on-prem and your cloud workloads. So what this looks like is the following. So first, we'll start off with the self-contained applications. These are your Microsoft Office or, say, your Creative Cloud Suite, where these applications do not have a backend. This is really easy to migrate, mostly because you don't have to account for different types of internet access. In terms of the files that they work on, they usually just work on your cloud workload, or you just bring the files over. But then things that get more complicated is the web applications and your SaaS apps. So for your SaaS applications, you might have to have your considerations of access. Maybe you have to set up your AD to make sure that they are unified. You might have Okta that you have to account for. These are types of situations that might be a little bit more complicated policy-wise when migrating. Then we have a client-server applications. This is your SharePoints, your Skype for Business, where you have to worry about latency. And latency is something that we probably touched on for a little bit when it comes to site-to-site connectivity. But if you're, for example, having Skype, you want to make sure that you don't have, let's say, more than 50 ms, because video lag will really degrade your quality. And then you have your legacy N-tier applications. As mentioned, these are these scary applications where your backend might be on an on-prem SQL somewhere, or you might have just all sorts of deployments that was written proprietarily like 10 years ago. You're not really sure who's still managing the application. So it's probably going to take you maybe a few months or so to figure out what it's going to look like. As over time, for example, you might want to, again, migrate the cloud for the easier ones first, and then deal with the messy cases later, or just, again, leave it on the on-prem center and just have a few servers lying around.
One thing I'll add on that slide, this really ties back into the initial 4 factors, particularly around your network connectivity and your identity, right? Your applications are going to be what dictates this. For instance, that latency, that could be a reason why you might choose dedicated fiber over an SD-WAN is because you have a specific application that just can't tolerate the latency, and you need that low latency dedicated connection to solve it.
Yep. So next we're going to get into disaster recovery. This is actually my favorite. But we're going to role play as a CIO for a moment. We're now going to be accountable for Acme Worldwide. So we're going to be setting up the scenario where it's a retail company with its headquarters in Atlanta with around 200 or so employees. Their primary data center, they got a really good deal for co-location in Dallas using Azure US Central as a DR site. They have remote workers and a desire for our RTO. They're going to be running Citrix Hypervisor in Dallas with around 25 Citrix VDAs. And I want to take a moment to point out that usually we get a lot of questions related to high availability versus disaster recovery methods. Disaster recovery is a type of setup where you have an active passive, as in your cloud site isn't actively having workloads until you need it, whereas high availability is where it's active, where you want to distribute all workloads evenly. That's not really suitable for a disaster recovery situation. Leo is going to take us through what the preparation and things you have to account for a disaster recovery.
Sure. So as we've emphasized multiple times throughout this presentation, step 1, network connectivity. So we don't want to wait till we have a DR event to start to figure out how are we going to get our headquarters connected up to Azure. Likewise, we want to make sure that if we're using a VPN or SD-WAN, Is our internet connection going to be able to handle all that extra traffic now going out to Azure in the event of a DR scenario? So this is step one, plan this out. Step two, identity, right? With Active Directory, the best option here is going to be to extend our AD into the cloud up front. Let's have an AD site already going, everything's replicating up there. This company, Acme, they want to save a lot of money by not running their DR site all the time. They're just going to spin it up on demand in Azure. But you do have to have some basic infrastructure already up there and running ahead of time. AD is going to be a big one. Then comes the Citrix infrastructure. So you definitely want to get your golden images up there. We'll talk again in a few minutes on how you can build the image for both the Xen server on premises and in Azure using things like app layering. The other thing is you'll need to install some connectors. Just like I said with AD, this is going to be some of that core infrastructure you want running up ahead of time before a DR event. Our cloud connectors auto-update. If you power them down, leave them offline too long, they're not going to register when they come back up. You'll have to reinstall them. So I'd recommend just have your 2 cloud connectors up and running. Make sure you have your master images there. Get those up ahead of time. And then fourth is going to be your data. Now, obviously, this is really important. And this is where a lot of third-party technologies come in. You're going to need either replication for databases, such as SQL replication. You might use some disk mirroring solution to get disk images up to the cloud and keep them synced up. We'll talk about Azure Site Recovery as one option that you can use for your data.
So really quickly, we're going to go through the replication technologies that you have for your user data and how to account for your images. One is you might want to go with an automated disk creation, such as Citrix app layering. And then for your user data, you really want to look into investing where your cloud storage, where your share file, and your OneDrive can help with the replication of user data. There's also third-party SQL Server replications or sharding that you can take with your databases. And then in addition, right, you have Azure Site Recovery, as mentioned before, which we'll get into as the ability to be able to handle your replication. Next, we want to get into Citrix app layering. So as mentioned, when it comes to your images, one thing that you have to account for is you might have a different hypervisor on-prem than you do in Azure. So you just maybe can't throw your Citrix hypervisor images or your VMware images into Azure. You actually have to make sure that the same hypervisor or the hypervisor layer is accounted for. Citrix app layering can help with this. As you might know, it composes images of independent layers where you have an application layer, your platform where the hypervisor lives, and then the operating system layer. And then basically it collapses these layers to produce a master image. You want to make sure that you have multiple images produced so to account for the different hypervisors or where your applications might live. Application installs only need to be done once to update all the master images. And this might be useful when accounting for your cloud site. Next, we're going to get into Azure Site Recovery. So Azure Site Recovery is a technology in Azure where it replicates your disk images. Basically, what happens is for your VMs, you can pay a flat fee for replication technology for your servers, but then you do not get charged for the VMs until they're powered on. So what happens is over time, it will keep a copy of your data at a certain point in time into the Azure site, and then failover is manual. And when this happens, you're able to, oh, what? Oh, OK. Cool. Well, Leo is going to help us actually get back online. So, yeah.
All right. So let's say we actually do have a DR event. We talked about the preparation. What do you actually have to do when things come up? Step one is going to be the data. So just as Angelo was about to lead into, a lot of times the data failover is manual. In the case of Azure Site Recovery, you log into Azure. You hit the failover button, which is actually going to spin up VMs based on the latest disk images that were replicated. That's how you've got those VMs up there. Database replication may also be a manual failover event to bring your databases, your cloud databases, your cloud replica as your primary. It's going to vary from one service to another. Next is going to be to spin up that capacity. So we wanted to use DR in the cloud to save money, right? We didn't want to pay for our 25 servers running 24/7 in a DR site when we're not using them. This is the time that we would take those golden images, we'd use machine creation services, spin up those 25 VDAs. Next is where we'll actually switch over. So if you're using Citrix Workspace, this is going to be automatic, right? We have a highly available Citrix Workspace that can be your front end. Our gateway service is spread out across 14 different POPs, so it is highly redundant. Some customers do run their own gateways, their own on-premises storefront. If that's the case, then this would be the time to switch the DNS. If you're using AD internally, you would be able to change it because you've got AD up and running in the cloud. If not, maybe you're using a highly available third-party DNS vendor. You could log into them and change your NetScalers and storefronts over to the failover site. And hopefully, we meet our 4-hour RTO, and we don't need that 4th hour, but have some spare time just in case.
So I want to take a moment to also probably mention that when it is time, when your outage is over, now your cloud site is actually going to be ahead in time data-wise than it is your on-prem data center. So once your data center is restored, replication actually has to be done back before you're able to switch over and make your data center primary. This actually takes longer than the actual RTO. So this is actually going to take some time for the two sites to sync before you're able to just have your Azure Central site go back into DR mode and be ready for another outage. So again, as mentioned, manual failover in the beginning, and then you have to press that red button again just to engage it back. So next we want to talk about burst. And before we get into it, I want to basically describe the different types of workloads, and it's going to help us really understand what to account for. One is your base load. So these are your cyclical, very expected workloads that you might have. You have your employees clock in at 9 a.m., they clock out at 5, and you're able to account for what happens. Next is your expected burst. So these are situations that you know that there's going to be expansion happening. Let's say your company is going to be acquiring a new company, or it's a seasonality in terms of retail or call center. You know this is going to be happening, so you're going to scale up to handle those types of things, but however, you will be able to wind it back down. And the third one, which is arguably my favorite, is unexpected burst. So you have some sort of event that happens or something's not available and the workloads start to shift very unexpectedly and you have a lot of capacity, so you don't have enough capacity to handle the demand. So we'll talk about Acme again. So let's assume we mentioned that they were a retail company, so they're going to have retail workloads. And Leo will help us talk through how to handle that demand. Sure.
So this is a typical customer usage pattern. We get this telemetry in the cloud, and quite honestly, 75–80% of customers look exactly like this. It's a very repetitive, every week, the same sort of pattern, Monday through Friday, usage, Saturday, Sunday, light usage, and then it repeats week after week. Now, Acme's a retail company, so they're a little unusual in that they have seasonal variants too. So there's the holiday season towards the end of the year where their load gets higher than it is the other 9 months. Occasionally, though, maybe they have a sale in May and spikes up one random week in the middle of the year, not part of the holiday season. That happens too. This is a great solution for a product like Autoscale because you can leverage the cloud. You can only pay for that burst capacity when you need it. Now, as Angelo said, the first type of usage to consider is your base load. Now here, I've drawn the base load as basically the highest usage on every week, right? Some customers may say I'll only provision for 80% base load of my typical weekly load, but the reality is cloud vendors offer huge discounts for reserved instances. If you're going to commit to a year, 2 years, 3 years, you can save 50 to 80%. Now, I've seen some customers try to use Autoscale, and they'll say, let's go ahead and power everything off at night, and then the next morning we'll power it back on. Yes, you can save 30–40% doing this, but the discounts you'll get from the cloud vendor by just committing for a year and running it 24/7 most likely are going to be better. So that's why I would say when you think about your base load, think about at least 80% of your typical weekly usage. That's what you're going to want to consider your base load, even in a retail company like this that has very spiky usage. Next are the expected burst. So let's say our base load is 25 VMs, but during the holiday season, let's add 7 more. Now you could go into Autoscale, you could say, I'm just going to raise my minimum up, it will provision some more. It's really easy to do, but then you'll have that capacity during the holiday season, so if there is that Black Friday rush, you don't want Autoscale to be slowly ramping up VMs as things are slowing down. You want those provisioned. That's going to be the expected burst. And then last but not least, this is where autoscale really shines. So at all times, let's say we have a buffer capacity of another 10 VMs in Azure at all times that we can burst into. Now, during that unexpected spike in May, we ramped up. We had some instances on demand. We only paid for these tiny little spikes. It would cost very little. But by using the cloud, we were able to have that extra capacity at all times whenever we needed it. Now, one thing with that burst capacity, and this is counterintuitive for customers coming from an on-prem environment, is that typically smaller is better. Now, on premises, a lot of you may get 20, 30, 50 users on RDS VDA. In the cloud, though, in general, we'll see customers provision more for 10 to 15. And the reason for that is the ability to burst and autoscale. So we pulled some numbers from Azure. Let's say I've got 36 users, and based on my workload, I need 2 D3 V2 instances to handle those. Each of these instances can handle 18 sessions each. Now instead, let's say instead of D3 V2, I evaluated one instance size smaller. Now this has half the memory, half the cores, and it actually handles less than half the number of users. The reason for that is there's some overhead of just the OS, the VDA, the applications, that's going to be constant regardless of the instance size. So instead of getting 18 sessions on each VDA, I only get 8 on the smaller ones. Therefore, I need 5. Now, doing the math, this doesn't look like a good trade-off. I'm paying $1.06 an hour for the large instances, and I'm paying $1.35 an hour for the 5 small instances. But this is only when 36 users are logged in. What about when 3 users are logged in? Well, with 3 users, odds are both of those 2 VMs have to be powered on. Now, you can do things like set idle timeouts, disconnect timers. This will help to log off those users who aren't actively using the product. But if a user's actually actively using the session, you're keeping a very expensive VM on just for one user. Now, in the case of having 5 VMs for the exact same workload, if I have 3 users, 2 of them are guaranteed to be idle. Therefore, I'm already saving money. I'm paying 81 cents an hour for those 3 VMs versus I'm still paying $1.06 for the 2 large ones. Another user logs off, and the savings goes even greater. So in summary, we talked about 4 different use cases today. These are all great use cases of why customers use virtual apps and desktops and deploy in hybrid configurations. We see customers constantly ask us about disaster recovery. They don't want to pay double the cost to have a DR site, but they want that reliability of always having that extra capacity. They can go spin it up in the cloud if something happens to their primary data center and only pay a small amount for just the base infrastructure that still has to run even when it's not a DR event. Second use case is phase migration. We talked about the apps. We frequently hear even from customers that have move everything to cloud strategy. Well, this is going to take 3 years, and then it takes 4 years, and then it's 5 years. You have to look at the apps. It's just, there's ROI involved as far as what you're going to move to the cloud and what may just remain on-prem for quite a while. Geo expansion, another big use case. You've got overseas workers. You don't want to build out data centers there. There's public cloud vendors that can give you infrastructure in those countries, and you don't have to own it. And then we just wrapped up with Cloud Burst, right? Burst is another great use case where you can just always have some extra buffer capacity for your virtual apps and desktop site in the public cloud, and only for a few days out of the year are you even paying for it. Now, with all 4 hybrid use cases, the 4 key considerations are the same. You always start with your site-to-site connectivity. You need to size that network connection, determine your latency requirements. Am I going to get private fiber? Am I going to use SD-WAN? You then need to go to identity, figure out how to connect your AD up to the cloud. Third is external access. Are you going to use the cloud gateway, or are you going to manage your own gateway VPXs or MPXs? And then you go configure it. And then finally, we talked about a few use case specific requirements. For disaster recovery, we really need to think about how are we going to replicate our images and our data up to the cloud. When it comes to the phase migration and geo expansion, we need to think about the apps. What are the apps? What are the ones that we're going to move to the cloud? What are the apps that we're going to leave on premises? And then for burst, you want to think about how do I properly use autoscale? What do I use for reserved instances, or what do I keep on-prem? And what is the capacity that I'm going to scale up and down using on-demand instances?
Seems like we have some time left, so I think we can go take some questions, as there's a mic right now over there, and yeah. If we covered everything, that's great.
Don't be shy.
Yeah.
Anything?
Wow, I guess we're the best presenters ever.
Right. Yeah.
I wanted to address what you're just talking about load balancing or using smaller servers in the cloud as opposed to on-premise. So
Yeah.
if I understood your argument, you'd only see that situation maybe at the end of the workday when people were starting to log off and you only had a handful of people that logged in.
Yep.
You're not going to, most of the time, whether you have 2 servers or 10 servers or 20 servers, with load balancing, you're going to have at least one person logged in to most, if not all, of the servers. So is that really the only benefit that you would gain out of that?
Well, so what I typically see in the telemetry we get from customers using SmartScale today and now the AutoScale feature that we're rolling out to the cloud, a customer will have a typical 8-hour workday, during which time they have all their capacity in use, or 80% of their capacity in use. The time to drain typically ranges from 4, maybe even to 8 hours a day, because you just have 1 or 2 users who stay on and work late. And the reality is you're spending half your time in that slide that I had, if you want to click on it. Yep, this one. You're spending half your day in a workload that looks like this. This is going to be the 5 p.m. to midnight time frame where you've got just a few users that are staying late, they're actively using their sessions, so you don't want to log them off, but you do have to keep the VMs running. So the reality is you're actually spending half your time in this very low usage mode, but you're unable to drain the VDAs because you've got 1 user on them.
So you really have to evaluate that based on the work schedule. If you're at 24/7, like healthcare or something, that might not be a viable model.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're not as much of a burst scenario if you actually have 24/7 usage.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I think we've got time for one more question.
All right, if so, well, before you leave, we have a recommended related one. If you enjoyed this one, we do have a session on Windows Virtual Desktop and Citrix. That's going to be tomorrow, Thursday at 4:30. Conference surveys are available via email and in the Synergy mobile app starting on Thursday as well. And if you want to, you can watch sessions on demand at citrix.com/synergytv. And if you want to download the session, it would be available from your MySynergy account on June 3rd. And in addition, we would like you to rate the session. And there's a cool little AR game that's been going on in Synergy, so you do get points for rating the session. On behalf of us at Citrix and on behalf of Leo, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.